Hello, everybody, and welcome to another wonderful episode of The Best Games Period. I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and with me this week is Naomi Lugo.
Hiya.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, yeah, and for people who are just tuning in, who are you? Why are you here?
Well, I'm Naomi, as you said. I'm a freelance games journalist. I've actually written for Extra Life, which Jack is a part of. And I'm here to talk about one of my favorite games ever, The Long Dark, and why I think it's one of the best games ever.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this game because you have been telling me to play it for, it seems like, years.
Yeah, I have a tendency to do that.
Well, and it's really interesting because I don't hear it come up a whole lot. And I have a theory as to why that is, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But so you've written for Extra Life, and I believe you've written for a few other places too.
Yeah, I've written for Axis. They mostly do music news, but they also do video game. I write video game news for them. I also write for a local publication. They're called Twin Cities Geeks, and they're based in Minnesota. Yeah.
Minnesota.
Oh,
yeah, you betcha. It's pretty funny. I actually met you last year. We bumped into each other at a local developer conference that's in the Twin Cities area, and we covered E3 together, and I feel like that's kind of the fire that forges incredible bonds between fellow journalists. So.
Oh, absolutely. E3 just kind of tosses you into the fire, and yeah.
You deal with it.
And you don't sleep, ever.
No.
Ever. No.
Definitely not. But you do eat. That's the good part.
You do eat. Lots of meat.
So, oh my gosh, I forgot about that. So much meat.
Meat 3.
Meat 3, that is right. If only Marcus were here. He'd be happy about that reference. He was on last week. We talked about Mortal Kombat. You should totally listen to that episode if you have not. Maybe before we jump into it, what have you been playing recently?
So actually, vamping up to this podcast, I've been playing a lot of The Long Dark, unsurprisingly.
Okay.
But before that, I was playing Ni no Kuni, getting excited for Ni no Kuni 2. Been playing Persona 5, because I finally got my hands on a copy of that. So excited. Love the Persona series. And I actually started Shadow of the Colossus.
Oh yeah, finally!
But I only beat the first couple Colossi, because it made me super duper sad to see the light go out on these poor, beautiful creatures' eyes. So I stopped playing for a little bit, but I promise I'll finish it.
Yeah,
but
I'm gonna admit, it took me a very long time when I first played Shadow of the Colossus to start feeling bad about killing these giant, majestic creatures. And I think that's just because video games up until that point had conditioned me to feel really good about killing stuff in games. And this was the first time that I felt like a game developer made me question that.
Yeah, and I went into the game totally filled with spoilers, so that kind of put me in the mindset of, oh, these creatures are gorgeous, colossi gods, versus just mountains to conquer. So I think that's part of what makes me so sad to kill them.
Yeah, I mean, in subsequent playthroughs, I just feel more and more melancholy about Shadow of the Colossus, but it's like a good kind of melancholy, the kind that you kind of get addicted to and you want to experience again.
Yeah.
So I feel you on that. And how did you feel about Ni no Kuni?
I am absolutely adoring it. I mean, I really don't know how I haven't played this game for so long. Like, it is an RPG, turn-based RPG, which is my jam. And the artwork is by Studio Ghibli. Like, and you get little Pokemon-esque monsters that you fight with. Like, come on. That just checks all my boxes. It is absolutely gorgeous. And it's a lot of fun. And it's challenging. I really appreciate that. I mean, it's a traditional JRPG where you're gonna get your butt kicked, you're gonna die. But that's what gets me hooked and makes me want to actually learn the systems and get good.
Now, I remember that game being reviewed well, but also kind of mid-range well. Have you kind of picked up on maybe why that would be?
Yeah, I've gotten about 15 to 20 hours in, so I'm still at the very beginning. So from what I've seen about reviews, it's more the combat that people had a problem with. And I can see where it will become a pain. I'm just still enamored with it at this point.
But it's a turn-based RPG, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I guess the enjoyment of Ni no Kuni hinges entirely on your tolerance for turn-based JRPG combat.
Definitely, definitely. There is a very, very steep learning curve. I've been playing it on normal, so I don't know what the easy mode is like, but I died in my first dungeon, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm playing a JRPG. I need to go train. I need to get my gear. I need to, stock up on potions and whatnot. I just kind of forgot about that while playing this game just because it is so beautiful and it seems innocent. It's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Just wait until the mid-game turn when everything becomes much darker. I haven't played it, so I don't know if that actually happens.
Kinda. So the story behind it is, it's kind of your typical story of child loses someone and has to step up and become a hero. And only has to become a hero in a magical world. He has to save that magical world. And in the process, you get magical powers, get those adorable little, I forget what they're called. They're familiars, and go around with, I think he has it's either Scottish or, Irish accent little creature named Drippy, and he's the Lord of the Fairies.
Oh yeah, Drippy, I remember him.
Yup.
I've been mostly playing Into the Breach. If you guys haven't heard of Into the Breach yet, you need to get on your social medias and stuff, because it's the next game by the people who made the FTL, Faster Than Light game a few years ago. That is absolutely wonderful. Everyone should play FTL, Faster Than Light. And Into the Breach is really fun. It's basically like a tiny turn-based Pacific Rim.
Oh my god. That is an adorable description of any game.
You play as a team of mechs, a team of pilots who control these giant mechs, and your job in any given mission is just to hold off the enemy giant monster kaiju from destroying buildings and saving as many people as possible without taking damage or destroying your own mechs. And it's basically just trying to survive this never-ending onslaught. And each mission is really nice and bite-sized, only 5 turns, and it's very, very tactical, and I enjoy it a lot. And it also has kind of that roguelike element to it, too, where every time you play it, it's a little bit different, never quite the same, and you have to defend these different islands. It's really good. I highly recommend it. I haven't finished it yet. I'll be doing a review on it soon, but that's what I've been doing.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, why did you nominate The Long Dark?
So, The Long Dark, I've been playing it since about 2015, and I just checked my Steam log on it, and that was kind of scary. On Steam alone, I logged 150 hours on it, and I've also played it on Xbox for another 100, maybe 150 hours.
Jeez.
So I've spent a lot of time with this game.
Yeah.
And it's one of those games that you fall into for a while, get completely obsessed with, kind of go find other games, but every time you go back to it, you kind of stumble back into it again and fall completely in love with it all over again. So I just want to kind of explore why this game has been so impactful, and not just for me, but I've seen a lot of people in the Long Dark community who are absolutely in love with this game.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I looked at it on Steam, and on Steam, the Steam reviews, the user reviews, are almost uniformly glowing. It has 32,000 or 33,000. I might be way misremembering that. In fact, I'm going to go look at it right now. 32,000. I was correct. I was worried it might be 3,000. I was adding an extra 0 in there. It has 32,000, and almost all the reviews are positive. At one point, it had a 99% positive rating on Steam. And then I looked at the Metacritic rating because I was curious, and it is sitting at a user score of about 6.8, which is interesting to me because it seems low.
Yeah, and I didn't know about that number. I hadn't looked at the Metacritic score for it.
It's much
Shows my bias.
Well, it's very low on the console versions. On the PC version, it's higher. It's at 8.2, but not quite at the 99% on Steam.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a lot of reasons behind that, and we can get into that later. But, I mean, part of the reason I think the reviews are so high on Steam on the user end is because of the sense of community that the developers have been able to create. And that's because they're so responsive to the community. And they're very open. They're very, very transparent about what the game looked like during each stage. I don't know how many logs they've done, but they've done a lot of logs.
Yeah.
A little bit of history on The Long Dark. For those who don't know, it is a survival game, and it is a very core survival game. So it doesn't have zombies or anything like that. You are a pilot, or it's different in story mode versus survival, but you basically start out as a pilot, and you crash in the Canadian wilderness, and you need to survive. And that's basically it in Sandbox. So you are left to your own devices to figure out how to interact with this world. And so the developers of this game, they're called Hinterland, and they are based from developers who came from AAA. So in 2013, I think, they started a Kickstarter for this game, and they raised past their goal. And they actually got funds from the Canadian Media Fund, I think it's called, to make this game. They went to alpha in 2014 on Steam and opened that up to the community. And then they were launched to early access on Xbox in 2015. And then August 2017 was the full launch of the game. So it's been around for a while.
I think that whole process, you attributed kind of the wide range of reactions between these different sites to the strong sense of community, and I do think that's very much a factor. I think another large part of it is it's one of the first games that I've seen, and I know that there are others, but it's one of the first really successful games that I've seen that has been able to implement this kind of journey from early access all the way to release. And so I think that there is this very wide range of opinions based on when people actually started playing The Long Dark. Because there are some people who played it right at the beginning, and even professional critics who played it right at the beginning, and were just kind of like, no, this is interesting, but Like, I was going back through a lot of the things that people had written about it, and a lot of people played the game right when it came out in 2014 on PC, in early access, and then they complained like, well, it's too small. Well, then at the tail end of 2014, they doubled the size of the game world. and then a few months later, they added another third huge chunk to the game. And so there are a lot of these different opinions on the game that don't necessarily reflect where the game is now. And I find that really interesting because there hasn't really been a period of development before where we could get that kind of a look at a game in progress.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was looking at the Kickstarter page for reference, and they have like this pre-alpha demo of the game, and it is drastically different from what you see now. It is insane how much the game has progressed. So it's really hard, I think, to separate the feeling you have playing the game in early access when it first comes out versus maybe a critic who came in and saw the Xbox One launch.
Right.
It makes this game and other early access indie games super interesting to critique.
I think it challenges how a lot of people view critique, in that a lot of people view it as a solid, definitive thing. Like, you wrote a thing, and that is the way that thing is forever, you know? And that's not... I guess I view it much differently, where I view it as part of a conversation, and conversations change over time. And so I think what early access has done is very interesting. It certainly makes critiquing harder, because you can't just now be like, well, Star Ocean 3 is the same Star Ocean 3 now as it was 10 years ago. Or however long that came out, 15 years ago.
Yeah, and it's really reflective of these games that will continue to be updated even after their launch. Like, games that launch, at least in this format, it's not the end, even though it might have had a full launch. Like, the Long Dark, they're still working on different maps to add, different features, different environments. And I think that's something that's kind of unique. Well, no, not necessarily unique to indie games, but we just see it a lot more in indie games where there's a dedicated team that will consistently put out good quality content for the base game. Like, we'll see it with something like Final Fantasy 15, where they keep on throwing random stuff at us, but it's not necessarily for the benefit of the game. It's kind of more for the benefit of just
the corporation.
Yeah, I was trying to steer away from that and not be too bitter, but that's pretty much why we're getting endless stuff from Final Fantasy 15.
Yeah. Even this podcast episode on The Long Dark will be interesting because the game still isn't technically finished yet, even though it has officially released. And so one of the general rules that I have for this podcast has typically been that for games, we try and wait a year after they release to do them. And I thought it would actually be interesting to kind of bend that rule because technically it didn't fully release until August of last year. But it's been available to play since 2014. So I think that having this as part of the discussion, it allows me to kind of bend that rule a little bit.
Yeah, that's why The Long Dark is the best game ever, because it's able to break the podcast. There we go. We're done here.
well, and it's interesting because even though it is fully out, the story mode that is part of The Long Dark only has 2 episodes out right now, and it's supposed to have 5, I believe?
Yeah, 5.
And those are still in the process of coming out. But when all of them do release, there's going to be an ungodly amount of content in this game.
Yes, and kind of speaking back to what we were saying, they actually went back and tweaked episode 1 and 2 after release. So it was not completely different. They made pretty significant changes to how those play based on community feedback, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, which is super interesting to me, too, because originally it was much more of a cinematic single-player story, but their original plan was to have episodes 1 and 2 be kind of these very linear adventure game segments where you're surviving in the wild and getting from point A to point B. It was highly controlled. And then players would get to episode 3, which has yet to be released. And at episode 3, that's kind of when the world would open up and players would be able to kind of forge their own direction in the world and, do whatever quests they wanted. And like you said, they got feedback on that and realized, well, maybe we need to go back and revisit what we thought. And even though the game was already out and already had these 2 episodes released, they decided to go with a less linear route. And so they actually went back and they redesigned the entire structure of how quests would work and how the story would be told. And they redesigned it so that from the get-go, it's a much more open experience. You can do a lot of different quests in any order you'd like. And that, to some degree, entailed taking out a lot of the cutscenes that they had been working on and a lot of the cinematics.
Yeah, I mean, my game that I played was before all of this, and I'm really interested in going back and replaying at least the intro, because I had quite a bit of qualms with the intro when I first played it. So imagine this, like, I had been waiting for story mode since 2015 when I started playing, and it came out in 2017. So I downloaded the game, and then immediately was pretty disappointed, actually. The way that the intro to episode 1 played was very much tutorial, which I completely understand. New players are going to need to know the basics behind the game, otherwise.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's a very challenging game.
I mean, my first experience with it was booting it up survival mode on, like, the baby setting and I wound up not knowing how to even remotely how to survive, and I just died after like 2 hours of wandering around.
Which definitely happened. So, the reason why I was so disappointed is I was playing the game how I had been playing it. I had been playing the game like a veteran, and my partner actually had to tell me, like, you need to just slow down and play the game how the developers want you to. And that was kind of a weird moment for me. I was like, but wait, I've been playing this game for 2 years plus. Like, I know how to play it. I want to just get into story mode. So I think they also heard that a lot from the community and adjusted it accordingly. I believe they added 3 new difficulty modes to that in response to that. But yeah, the game, and I think that's another reason why people love it so much, is you have to work to be able to play it. You have to dedicate a lot of hours into understanding the little things that go into surviving. I mean, it's something that I take for granted as a 200-hour plus veteran now. I mean, when I first told you about the game, you know, I definitely wasn't thinking about that. I was like, oh, you're going to jump in, you're going to love it, you're just going to explore and, you know, get to surviving and play your game. So when I heard the feedback that you died or not immediately, but died pretty quickly, I was really surprised, but it made me just think back to all the time that I've been playing the game, and it's like, yeah, in the beginning, what drew me to it was that punishing reality of, if I'm out in the cold and a snowstorm hits, I'm done. You know, I have to pay attention every second that I'm playing that game to, do I have enough food? Do I have enough resources? Am I walking fast enough to get to a shelter? Do I know where I am? All of those things go into factor in. And
so what is, I think we've talked a lot around the Long Dark, but what is the general setup for the Long Dark? Like, it is essentially a post-apocalyptic survival game, but it's different from any others that are out there at the moment, as far as I know.
Yes. So I was talking a little bit earlier about it, but you are a pilot, and so the way they describe it, at least the way they've described it before, is there's a geomagnetic event that essentially makes all the power go out. So that's why it's called the Long Dark, is because there's no lights, there's no electricity, and they call it the quiet apocalypse because there's, you know, you're stuck in the Canadian wilderness and there's nothing. So the question that they ask in this game is, when humans are separated from the technology that they've built, what will they do to survive? What will challenge them? So the way the game is set up is there is a sandbox mode, and then there is story mode, but then there's also challenges, and there's various different ways to play those challenges. So initially we had sandbox mode, and the way that they rolled the game out is they just kept on adding maps and tweaking it here and there. So I think we're now at something like 6 or 7 different maps. And I don't know the square footage on the maps or anything like that, but it's a pretty significant chunk. It'll take you a while to get through it as a beginner.
And they're all interconnected.
Yes.
So
you're on this island, and yeah, you can kind of travel along the railroad or the roads to get along to these different areas. And you can when you start up sandbox mode, you can choose the different areas that you want to start up in, and each of those areas has their own different type of challenges. So there's kind of a beginner area, and that's called Mystery Lake. It'll have a couple cabins, a decent amount of food, and stuff like that. So something like Coastal Highway is just littered with houses and stuff like that, but you're challenged with there's more wolves around. And then something like Timberwolf Mountain was a map they added a lot later on for more veteran players, and that is an extremely challenging area. Yeah, so there's different difficulties. I think there's 4 of them, and I'll try to remember them. It's Pilgrim, and that's the easy one. And that's where wildlife will run away from you. You're going to be pretty safe just exploring. It's a pretty good way to start, but you can still die. And it can still be very, very challenging because you have all of those different environmental factors that are going against you. And then there is Voyager. And that's a little bit more difficult. I believe in that one you can be attacked by wolves, and wolves suck. Wolves can suck a lot. And then Stalker, I think. Stalker is one where wildlife will actually actively hunt you, and that's really, really annoying. And Interloper. And Interloper is the most challenging. It is extremely punishing. I've only played a couple playthroughs of that, and yeah, it's really challenging.
Which was the most enjoyable for you?
I'm not quite at Interloper level yet, or at least I'm not comfortable at Interloper yet. I can't remember all of the factors that go into it, but it's like something like very scarce food, and you're being constantly hunted by wolves, so it's hard to start up the game.
People might think that like it's hard to start up the game in a difficulty sense, which is certainly true, but also there is kind of this underlying element to the Long Dark where the difficulty isn't necessarily off-putting, but there is certainly an almost nihilistic sense of like what's the point, and that's almost like the central question to me about the Long Dark. You know, what is the point of keeping on going? And that's actually something I saw come up in a lot of negative user reviews and a lot of people who didn't like playing the Long Dark. And I think part of it is that the game is asking you what is your personal take on this? What is your personal stance? And if your answer is ultimately like, well, this is pointless, surviving in this game is pointless because all you have to do is fight to continue to survive, maybe that's saying something about your underlying life philosophy as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's something I've thought about before. And I think what the conclusion I've come to is that this game is for people who are willing to tell their own story. And what I mean by that is while you're walking through, on a deserted road and you look up and there's snow and, you see maybe the aurora lighting up and you find that moment and you think it's something special. You don't necessarily have to have this narrative going in your head, but I mean, certainly some fans do that. But I think just being able to recognize those significant moments within your own game is what makes it worth it. So mostly it's not mostly, but it's a significant chunk of it is exploration of these worlds. There's a ton of hidden places to find. There's caches. Those are loaded with loot, and those are always awesome to find. There's various just little quiet locations, like there's deer stands that are littered throughout the world. There's little waterfalls. So I think that's a part of the reward system. And I mean, going back to making your own story, there are plenty of fans who do their own fan art and fan fiction based on the Long Dark.
Yeah, I mean, there to a certain extent, it is a good. I don't rely on it to teach you how to actually survive in the wild. I believe that's actually something that plays every time you boot it up. Yes. But it simulates that desperation and the need to kind of keep going.
Yes.
And maybe do uncomfortable or gross things. For example, the game totally guilt trips you if you want to kill a rabbit.
It's the saddest thing. You just look into this little fluffy bunny's eyes, and it's like, can I break this bunny's neck? Like, I need some food. Horrible. And that's a new feature that they actually added in after launch, I think, is you could stun bunnies with rocks and just murder them, and they make a little squeaking noise. It's so sad. But it's just one of those little tweaks that I think really adds to the game. And there have been times where I get super lazy while playing The Long Dark, right? And I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'm doing good. I have plenty of food. I'm in a comfortable area. I'm going to be fine. But the second I get complacent is when the game puts me in its place. And I have, even in easy walkthroughs, I have come so close to death because of that. And that's another part of why play The Long Dark, is to kind of push yourself and pay attention.
Well, Well, and one of the things you mentioned earlier was exploration and how big a part that plays in the experience of the Long Dark. And I agree with that 100%. Also, I would just like to add that exploration is both a privilege and a necessity, because you can't really explore unless you have the stuff for it, unless you have figured out how to survive in one location already.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of this learning curve of, or not learning curve, but like a balance you need to strike between exploring new areas and building up the resources that would enable you to survive that exploration process. Because the very first time I played, the mistake I made was wanting to explore and kind of get out of certain areas and just see where things were in the world. And that ultimately led me to, a cold, dark night in the middle of a blizzard, surrounded by wolves on a railroad track in the middle of nowhere. And
that's how so many deaths have happened.
And so, the next time I played, and my playthrough is still going because I'm still trying to learn all the different tricks, but it's lasted for like 10 plus hours. And I'm just in the very beginning area trying to figure out how to eke out an existence in this wasteland. And there's a mechanic that allows you to draw maps. And so I've been trying to map out the entire region. And there isn't really anything in the game that tells you, hey, you need to go here. Especially if you're not playing the story mode. If you're playing just the sandbox survival, there are no goals besides just surviving. And so, like you were saying with you need to be able to tell a story to yourself, you also need to be able to set goals for yourself. Like, my goal is to map out, this entire region before moving on to the next one. Or catch X amount of fish so that I know I'll be okay. Or, patch up all my gear to 100% so I feel ready to go to the next place. And
you will obsessively patch up gear and sharpen your tools.
And it's just this, there needs to be that desire or capacity to account for a lack of direct narrative being told to you. And if you have that, and not everyone does, and no judgments there, you're going to have a good time with the Long Dark.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to jump into story mode, because that addresses the whole issue of why even play the game, right?
Right.
So we have 2 episodes right now, and depending on how you play, they can take a considerable chunk of time. Like, I think through my first playthrough of Chapter 1, I played for about 20 hours. And this was the second time I'd played through Chapter 1. And completed it. I explored a little bit more, knowing what I was getting into. And so the way it's structured is you have a setup for a story. And you are essentially looking for someone you lost after a plane crash. And that's how they bridge the world between story mode and survival mode. So as you're going through story mode, you are in the sandbox world, but you have concrete objectives. You have to go here, do this thing, meet up with this person, do this fetch quest in order to progress. And there are cutscenes and voice acting. And so you go through the first chapter, and then the second chapter is kind of the same in that structure. And you kind of explore the world throughout the story, which I think they did a great job of. And I'm really excited to see what they do in Chapter 3 with the more open world element. Because going back to their Kickstarter, I noticed that they were talking a lot about interacting with other survivors. And I think that's something that they kind of were forced to neglect in survival mode, in sandbox survival mode for so long. I think they're really gonna shine through on Chapter 3 and beyond in exploring what it means to be a survivor in an apocalypse with other people.
Yeah, and just real quick about the voice acting, they got some voice acting talent.
Yes, they did. It's kind of funny. They got Fem Shep from Mass Effect.
Yeah, Jennifer
and Male
Hale.
Shep. Yes, which is really awesome and kind of a little Easter egg for fans there. And then they also have Snake in there, David Hayter.
Yeah, I was really excited about that.
Yeah, and it's just like, okay, cool. I can get on board with that. A little bit of Long Dark mixed with Mass Effect and
Metal Gear.
Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah.
Like, okay. Nice little bridging of worlds there.
One thing and this is a very small thing that I want to nitpick, and I don't know if you agree with me. You probably don't. I think that the way character models have these like weird white skin, like pale white, snow white skin and a super red nose. It freaks me out. I don't like it. I think it's because it reminds me of clowns.
That's fair. So actually describing the art, since we haven't talked about it yet.
Yeah, we haven't.
The artwork in The Long Dark is best described as kind of minimalist. It is absolutely gorgeous in my opinion. So yeah, how would you describe the art, Jack?
I guess I would describe it as almost crayon-like. It's like everything is done in crayon or colored pencil. It has a kind of almost a painted look to it. But
yeah,
it has
kind of pastels too.
Yeah.
Pastel tones.
Yeah, it's more gritty than paint though, which is why I was kind of comparing it to more of a colored pencil or a crayon look. It has more texture to it than just painted stuff. And
go ahead.
I was gonna say it's interesting because there are times when the game looks incredibly beautiful to me, and there are also times where sometimes you get up close to something, or something gets up close to you, like a bear, and that kind of beautiful illusion to me kind of falls apart a little bit on the super close-up inspection.
Okay.
And that might be less due to the art style, and in fact I would say it is not at all because of the art style, and more because of how the character models are constructed up close. There are just some polygons flailing around on screen.
Yeah, I noticed that when at nighttime and there's a fire, you'll have some polygons, going haywire there.
Yeah.
But going back to the character models, again, I'm very biased. I think it's an absolutely beautiful art style that lends itself a lot to the game. And what they did with the characters, I think suits the style of the world, so it's okay for me.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think I was speaking off the cuff about it reminding me of clowns, but the more I think about that, the more I think that is actually 100% why I'm like, ew, please no.
Yeah, and I kind of came to expect that the characters would look like that before I saw the full launch, because they unrolled this thing called the paper doll UI system, and that's where the screen where you see what your character is wearing and all your gear, which is a hugely significant part of the game and I'm so glad they added it. But the way the character looks is absolutely a paper doll. It's pretty basic, that red nose, just flat kind of character. So I kind of had a feeling that they'd be going that way in the art style. So I guess I was able to brace myself for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it doesn't bug me, and it again might be my bias.
Question: do you play in survival mode? Do you play as a guy or a girl?
I play as female because we need more female representation out there.
For sure, I also play as female, just because I think it's not a more interesting story. But a less common story than man surviving in wilderness.
Yes.
Shout out to another podcast that I enjoy listening to. It's called The Dollop. It's a much larger podcast with a much larger following. Have you ever heard of it?
I have not. Don't hate me.
I don't. It's a podcast about American history, and they did an episode a couple weeks ago about a woman who, it's like the 1800s in Texas, and she marries a guy, and he's like, hey, I built us a cabin out in Native American territory. And she's like, cool, let's go live there. And then she gets abducted by, this Native American tribe. And they realize that they're being chased after by her husband and some people from the town nearby. And so they try and kill her, and they put like a spear in her back, and she falls off a cliff. And then everyone just presumed that she was dead, except that she wasn't dead, and she survived for like 4 weeks out in the woods on a cliff and eventually made it back to society. This is a comedy podcast, by the way. So
okay, you can totally tell.
It's actually a super interesting story, and I highly recommend everyone check that out. I can't remember exactly the name of which episode it was, but it was a really interesting tale of survival in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, and that's kind of what I get out of The Long Dark too.
Okay.
Like it's the entire point of The Long Dark is that the world is stacked against you. Even if you're playing it on not necessarily the hardest difficulty setting, but even on, one step above the easiest, wolves will still come around to your camp and menace you, and you'll have to go on the run, and it can get really tense and scary. And none of it is scripted. It's just the world's systems working as they would if you weren't there and responding to you.
I've had so many heart attacks playing that game, having a wolf sneak up on me. Or even the stupid deer. You're walking quietly along, and all of a sudden a deer will just come running past you. It scares the crap out of you because you just have to be on guard at all times. This game is designed for you to want to explore it and want to look around and see the beautiful snow falling on the trees. But if you do that, you can die. You can get so distracted by the beauty of the game that you can just get colder and colder and just slowly start dying.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked a lot about this as a survival game. And I guess I'm curious why you think that this one stands out from the pack, pun intended. Especially when currently there seems to be kind of this glut of survival games. It kind of seems to be the thing at the moment. So what makes this different?
So when you think survival game, at least in the broader sense, you get a lot of zombies, right? You get a lot of
zombies.
A lot of co-op. I think The Long Dark is the survival game that gets the closest to getting to a true survival experience. Earlier I described it as a core survival game. And that's because you don't have a lot of those cliches to lean on, like zombies, for tension. You get tension out of interacting with this world and having the world exist around you. It's not necessarily even coming after you. Yeah, the wolves come and attack you, but you experience the world, and the world is just there. Like you said, the mechanics of the world are just working their way around you existing there. And I think a lot of other survival games, they need something to push you to the edge. Even something like Don't Starve, which is another one of my most favorite games. It's a brutal permadeath survival game, just like The Long Dark. But it has a lot of elements that kind of push it along. There is a story mode in that too. And there are enemies. And it's not solely about the world. And it's not realistic because you're in this magical realm, right? The only other game, I think, at least in my experience that I've played, that gets close to this core survival experience is an indie game called, oh my gosh, what is it called? The Flame and the Flood.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And that game, it's a lot more basic than The Long Dark. You are an isometric view, I think, and you are navigating with your puppy dog and trying to survive a flood. And it's very basic mechanics. You are on a raft, and it's difficult to steer this raft. If you bump this raft into anything, your health on the raft is going to go down. And if your raft breaks, you will drown and you will die in the end. And there are elements like you can get food poisoning, and you will have to, hunt wolves to get around them. It's punishing. It might even be more punishing than the Long Dark at times.
I also played that, and I would describe it as more arbitrary than the Long Dark.
Yes.
Because often it feels like in the Long Dark, if I die, it's because I screwed up and I made the wrong choice.
Yes.
In Flame in the Flood, sometimes you're just done, and there's nothing you could have done.
It's frustrating.
Yeah.
It's like you'll maybe nick a rock while you're on your raft, and you'll die, and it's like, okay, cool. I did my best, or the game lagged or glitched or something like that. It's an amazing game. Like, I love the game, but you're right. It's not so much responsibility of you to learn the world as much as work around the game. And I think the Long Dark does a lot better job in having this live world that you have to learn, similar to reality. Like, if you were stuck out in the Canadian wilderness, you would have to figure out how you fit in that world as the survivor you are.
See, I think if I was stuck in the middle of the Canadian wilderness in this scenario, I would just die. There'd be no question about it. I would just be like, well,
I mean, realistically, if we are attacked by wolves, we're not just going to stab them a couple times and have them run away and then have that process repeat. We're going to just be killed by a wolf, right? So, I mean, we have to take some artistic liberties there.
Yeah. So I guess I agree with you where the difference to me with the Long Dark and other survival games is that it leans more into the survival element of it. It's much more, even though the systems are still gamified, it feels more like you are pursuing survival. Whereas, if you're in a zombie apocalypse game, you're killing zombies, you're getting around zombies. They're the main thing that are attempting to kill you. And this one is much more grounded, where Mother Nature's the one that's really going to kill you. But you have all the tools at your disposal to try and avoid that. And I think ultimately that makes it a very unique survival game. I've never really seen anything else like it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a game that is meditative while at the same time absolutely demands you to be on your toes. And I think that's a part of what makes it that unique experience that you're describing.
Well, yeah, it is very meditative. It wants to both have your entire attention and also to give you enough downtime to kind of think about what you're doing and what it means and kind of what the point is both in game and I think maybe in a larger sense in life. And so and that to me, I mostly played the sandbox. I didn't really dive into the story mode too much, but even without writing and talking, there was a whole lot to kind of dig into just with how the systems of the game work and what they force you to do as a player that I find really, really interesting from a narrative standpoint. And also, I mean, and I said without writing, but there are letters and notes hidden around the world that you can find at different campsites or on bodies or in houses that kind of paint this picture of a whole cast of characters that you've never met, but you can imagine being real. And I really enjoyed that because I would find myself being alone for so long in the game that you start finding these notes and you're like, oh, I wonder what this person was like. And then you would have, 15, 20 minutes of just kind of silent walking along through the wilderness to think about who that person was and what that note meant.
Yeah, it incites, it does a really good job of forcing you to place yourself in the game. And that's a point you've touched on a lot, is that it makes you think of who you are as you, not even as a protagonist necessarily. Like, you're not playing as how you play Cloud, You're not even making decisions as a Commander Shepard. You are you in this game, at least in Sandbox. do you choose to kill the bunny?
I did not, for the record.
Yeah.
I couldn't find it in me.
Or are you the type who's going to try to explore every location? Are you the type who's just going to stick to the roads? And I think that's something that is really special, especially in a medium like video games that demands the player to be inserted in the game anyways. I think it just takes it to the next level where it is you as a person in the game.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I'm really interested, and again, we started off this conversation talking about how this was still in development. I'm interested, well, not in development, maybe mechanically, but from a story perspective.
It's being tweaked.
Yeah. I'm interested to see, in another year, what is the Long Dark going to be like? Because it will inevitably be very different. And the places that we are approaching the Long Dark will also be different. And so will it be an entirely different experience for us to play in another year?
And I mean, if you look at its past, it has transformed dramatically, but it still keeps that core gameplay, I think. And I'm not sure if the developers have plans to make it any different than it was, or if they just plan on enhancing it from now on. Like, one of the things that they're going to add is as simple as moose, moose in the environment. I think they already added them, I just haven't seen them yet.
Yeah, I think they have, yeah.
And just adding little elements to make the world even more real, versus, adding different types to the gameplay. But I think what challenges did, the actual challenges mechanic in the game, where they have, and again, let me try to remember these. There is, what are they called? One of them is called Nomad, and you start these challenges, and it's a set amount of time usually. So in Nomad, you have to, the challenge is to stay at each location for 5 days, I believe, and you have a map. So you have to stay at a barn in one of the worlds for 5 days, and stay in, the dam for 5 days. And each of those locations has its own different sets of challenges, right? And then there's more action-packed ones where it's like the hunted part 1 and 2. You are being hunted by a bear, a big old grizzly bear, and you have to kill it before time runs out. And then there's, what are the other ones called? Whiteout, where you have to gather enough food and supplies before a certain amount of days or you'll die. I think the developers adding those challenges to the game was excellent, because players of the Long Dark, we're obviously in there for the long haul, but if you give us more ways to play the game, we are going to do it. Like, I've played through most of those challenges, and they were awesome. They made the game different for me, because I might have been in the world and explored the world ad nauseum, but when I'm forced to stay in a certain location for 5 days, it makes me look at it in a different way. Like, I can go crazy staying at this barn for 5 days. What am I going to do with myself? And I think that was a good way to add life to the game. And I don't know if, so I guess the roundabout way or point I'm trying to get to is, I don't know how much content they can make in this game, and I don't know how much they plan on. It's such a different game from other games that it makes it hard to see the full scope of what it could be. Like, going back again to Final Fantasy 15, we have the base game, we have the story, it's done. The story is done. They can add other parts to it, like you can see episode Ignis, but they're not really going to be able to introduce it in different ways like the Long Dark has with these challenge modes, the story mode, different maps.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
So I guess one of my questions would be, how do you see the Long Dark, do you see there ever being a Long Dark 2?
So the developers of this game, or at least Raphael Van Lierop, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He has unabashedly declared this game a Canadian game. Like, he wanted to go back to his roots and explore Canada. So I don't know if they'd ever think of different locations. Like, I would love to have a long, dark survival game in different locations and just explore what it means to survive in maybe a jungle or something. But I think what makes it so special is that he made the goal, and the team made the goal, to show this place that they came from and that they love so much.
Yeah.
So I don't know if The Long Dark 2 would look like an expansion on story, maybe looking at different survivors, or if it would be a completely different look at a survival game.
And I think you touched on something in there too about this being a very personal game for the developers. And I think that bleeds over into from a player perspective too, because it feels very personal when you're playing. And
Absolutely.
It lacks like that co-op, like Don't Starve has a co-op mode. A lot of survival games end up having co-op modes. Minecraft, all these different games. But The Long Dark doesn't have that. And I think that is on purpose, and I think that contributes to a lot of how introspective this game ends up being.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine The Long Dark co-op. I feel like everyone would just start getting lost. I'm getting attacked by a wolf over here, help!
Where's here?
Because, I mean, one of the things in the game is it's so easy to get lost. But, yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that could be explored in the idea of survival games in general, at least these kind of realistic survival games. Yeah, I think that would be really... I mean, I'd be down to play pretty much anything that these guys put out at this point.
Well, and we didn't really talk about the full team at Hinterland, but they have some pretty big clout. Like, they have a guy from the Morrowind game. They have, people from BioWare. They have all these kind of heavy hitters in the industry.
Yeah, definitely veterans of the game industry, like veterans with 10 to 20 years experience kind of veterans.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't doubt what they'd be able to do. I think they would just have to be passionate about it, and that's the core of developing good games in general, right? Is trying to convey this experience in the best way that a developer can. So I don't know if The Long Dark would be the end of the road for Hinterland, because I know that the studio that did Flame in the Flood, that was the only game they made, and they kind of went back to AAA titles, I think. So I don't know.
I just like, because looking at their roster, like, they have the former lead from Volition, they have the writer from God of War, they have the audio engineer at BioWare. Like, they have all these people, and that is the kind of like Dirty Dozen. What?
It's a dream team,
yeah.
A super band.
Yeah, that is the kind of Dirty Dozen type squad that could probably do just about anything. So it's really exciting to see where they would go next if it was outside of this game too, especially if they were very passionate about that subject. So I guess we're heading up to the end here. So lay out your best argument, final closing thoughts about why you think The Long Dark should be considered one of the best games, period.
Oh boy.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. The Long Dark is one of the best games, period, for me, because of the love that went into this game. It is so obvious to see that love, and we've been talking about it kind of this entire time, is the love in the detail. The love that it takes for them to actually listen to the community, listen to some of the tough criticism from the community, and the developer diaries can be, you can feel the pain there. that they actually listen and actually do something in their game to respond to the community that they are trying to serve is what makes this one of the best games. And it actually translates is another thing. They actually are able to implement the changes that they want to see. They take feedback like it's too easy and make it more punishing. They give the player those options to be able to fully enjoy the game. And it might be an altruistic way of looking at it, but I think that's how game development should be across the board, especially from these AAA titles that we seem to get no love back from the big developers, right? We say, hey, EA, stop doing lame things and asking for more money. We just want to play this game that we want to love. We want to love these games. I think that's the core of what makes gamers such a passionate community, is we want to love the products that come out of it. And when we see the developers actually listening to us and responding, it makes it so much more of a powerful experience. And that's why they were able to create this dedicated community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the short answer for why EA doesn't listen to its fans or the people who play its games is because they want more money, and they're a publicly traded corporation, and so they have an incentive to just do whatever, even if it screws over the people who love their games, because at the end of the day, they care more about the bottom line than the games they're actually putting out.
And that's why these developers came from these AAA studios, is because they saw that pattern and they wanted to do something different. And I think that's commendable.
Right, and especially as a smaller company, and a smaller independent company, they have control over what happens to their game. Like, they were able to get the funds necessary to keep this game in early access and keep working on it for several years. And that probably wouldn't fly at EA. Especially,
nope. Especially EA is probably the worst example.
But, I mean, that goes for all, in my opinion, all publicly traded corporations kind of have that incentive to not care about the final product and instead care about the bottom line. That's probably an entirely different discussion, though.
Yes, and that's why we have so many Pokemon games that are pretty much all the same. But again, another time.
So I think that there are a lot of games that also have a whole lot of love that go into them that, they don't have the chops to back it up, and that's kind of a harsh thing to say, but it's true. There are a lot of very talented people, or people who have a lot of very lofty dreams, who cannot back up what they want to accomplish. And that's not to say that they could never back that up. That's not to say no one should ever try to do something risky, but it's very clear to me that Hinterland has the chops to pull off kind of these bigger ideas. And I think that's very obvious when you play The Long Dark. It's a very pure experience.
Yeah.
Like, it is exactly what it's setting out to be. And I think, to your point about responding to fan feedback, I think that they not only have the ability to go through the feedback that they're getting, but also to parse it out in useful ways, because it can often be very overwhelming to go through a huge amount of feedback, which they were getting for years.
Especially when there's trolls out there, right, who are just trying to derail them.
Right, and I think that they had the talent to kind of be able to read that and put it into their game in positive, constructive ways. And I think that takes a whole lot of courage and a whole lot of artistic integrity to be able to get that kind of feedback and then actually make sweeping changes. Because the example you mentioned is, making something a little harder, which I think from a developer standpoint, that's probably easy to do relatively. But one of the things we mentioned earlier in the podcast is how they went back and they redesigned the entire first and second chapters of their narrative, like the core narrative that they had planned for this game, that they had thought they had finished, that they had actually even released to everyone. That's like ripping out the first third of your script and just throwing it out the door and rewriting it based on feedback. And I think that takes a whole lot of courage.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when they put so much time and personal, for lack of better term, personal soul into it, You can tell that they put a lot of themselves in the game. So, I mean, it's hard to hear criticism at any level, but it takes, like you said, courage to be able to accept that it might make what you're making better, and that what you're making is beyond yourself, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess my ultimate answer is that yes, I think it's the best game, period. it's
Sure.
I was very doubtful when you kept suggesting I play it that it would actually live up to what the glowing things that you were saying about it, but it did, and I very much enjoyed all the time I spent playing this game, and so thank you for recommending it and nominating it for the show.
And if anyone out there has not played it yet, definitely get your hands on it. But, I mean, pay attention to what we were saying earlier and realize that it might not be completely your jam, but there's something to be said about that game in terms of the video game industry in general.
And I guess I would also encourage people who are, thinking about picking it up, don't look up guides. Don't look up strategy guides, because I think part of this game is figuring out how to do it yourself. And there are a lot of little surprises in there.
And that can make it very punishing. A lot.
Yes, please don't play it on the hardest difficulty your first time.
Unless you're like super pro at survival games, then go for it. But I mean, it was hard for me to imagine what Wintermute, and that's the story mode, would be like as a first time player. Because it is heavily reliant on you traveling to different locations to do certain things. I mean, there was one point where I had to travel to a new location in the game that I hadn't been to before that was new to story mode, and I got lost. I got super lost. I had to start, I got frustrated and stopped, and then started the game over again, right? Just to find where I went wrong. And that made me think of how difficult it could be for someone who had never played this game, because in your little log, it'll simply say, go to the cabin, do the thing. And it's like, okay, for someone like me, I know exactly what cabin they're talking about. I know exactly where this dam is, but someone who hasn't played the game before, no. So, yeah, guides is definitely a whole different discussion on its own, is whether or not guides are a good thing. But
I mean, I'm generally pro guide. Especially if you're having a tough time. I just think that there's something about tackling a survival game like this and kind of being thrown into the fire, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unless you're super stuck, stay away from the guides and just let the game be an experience.
Yeah. Because then you get the authentic experience of someone with no experience crashing in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, right?
But if that's all we have to say, I guess it's time to... I mean, I feel like we could keep talking about all these different tangents we've been going on for a very long time.
We definitely sound like gaming hippies. Like, it's totally about the experience, man, and it's a pure gaming experience. I could talk about this game forever, but that's a part of what makes it one of the best games ever.
So, where can people find you and your stuff that you work on online?
So, the best place to find me is Twitter, and that is at Naomi and Lugo. I'm also on Instagram, I believe, under the same name. Those are my main hubs, and I have some stuff in the works, so stay tuned there to see what's coming up.
And as for this podcast, you can find us over on SoundCloud and iTunes. We always appreciate a review. If you care to leave one, that always helps us out. You can also find us over on patreon.com at patreon.com/bestgamesperiod. If you listen to this show, if you like what we're putting out, please consider throwing us $1 every month. That kind of helps us keep the lights on and is very much appreciated. And on top of that, you also get access to some pretty cool little unique episodes that we have from time to time. So keep that in your mind hole.
And supporting creators is always a good thing. Yeah. If you're ever on the fence. Supporting people who are doing awesome stuff is awesome to do.
Yeah. And you can also find this podcast over on GameInformer.com and also on Extra Life. And if you've never heard of Extra Life before, it is an awesome charity that helps sick and injured kids across the United States and Canada. And basically, when you sign up, you can choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital you want to support, and then 100% of all the money you raise goes directly to that hospital to help those sick and injured kids. It's really fantastic, and it's all about gaming. So you get to play games and also help kids at the same time. What? You can do 2 of those things, and they're great! Go do them!
Do the thing. Do the thing.
Do the thing. And you can also, again, while you're over there at extra-life.org, you can also check out the community side of things, maybe meet some people in your area, do some fun stuff. And that is community.extra-life.org, where you can find this podcast along with a bunch of other articles that I write about games and gaming. There's a lot of cool stuff. One time I wrote about how an ex-NFL punter is making a board game with a video game journalist. That's a thing that's happening. Cool. Yeah. So go check all of that out. And I'm not sure what I'll have for you next week. Actually, I have an idea of what I might have for you guys next week, but we'll have to see about that. So all that said, do you have anything you want to add at the very end here, Naomi?
Play The Long Dark, and developers take notes from Hinterland. Yeah.
Yeah. And with that said, we'll see you on the Flippity Dippity.